Good day. Hope everything's going well with you. I am Blake Cooper. I'm a certified board trainer for the TEA, but I work as a consultant for Region 10, and I've been asked to give a presentation of the legislative update from the 87th session that just concluded, along with 3 special sessions. And so what we're going to do today is basically give a kind of a 30,000-foot overview of what took place. There's no way we can talk about everything that happened during the session. It was an interesting session, but hopefully when we're through with this here in a bit, you will have a little more insight of what took place, some of the legislation that happened during the time that the legislature was together. I always like to share a little bit about me, just so people kind of know my background. So you'll see that on the slide, and you'll see where I've been, what I've done, and I've been doing this now for Region 10 as my 5th year of doing board training, and probably close to 80 to 90 trainings at this point. And so it's something I enjoy doing, and again, hopefully this presentation today will help you out. I always start off my presentations with a slide that most people find humorous, because there are 3 things that tell the truth. That's small children, drunk people, and yoga pants. And so hopefully after this presentation today, we'll have some more truth to be a part of what we talk about. I want to begin with a saying. I actually got this from a presentation about 2 months ago that I attended, and I really like it because it does say a lot about this session, and I'm going somewhere with this, so I want to make sure that you understand that there's a point to it. And the saying is very simply, you don't know where you're going till you know where you've been. And I think it's important to understand a little bit of history in Texas and politics, and the climate that's in politics, in order to understand this session. And so let's look at some basic things. For example, in 2012, Mitt Romney beat Barack Obama in the presidential election by 12 points. Now understand that's in politics, that's a pretty good victory. And a lot of people will take it, they'll call it a tail kicking. But in Texas, obviously Barack Obama won, as we know, but Mitt Romney defeated Barack Obama quite handily in 2012. The next point in the gubernatorial election of 2014, Greg Abbott defeated Wendy Davis by 20 points. So that was a landslide victory for the Republicans. And then you look at the presidential election in 2016, Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton by 9 points. So when you look at the difference between 2012 and 2016, there wasn't as big a victory. When you start looking at things that were going on, even after that, if you remember the senatorial election, you had a pretty close race between Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke. And so because of that, there's a lot of people that felt like Texas was starting to turn blue. And you heard that in the news reports, you heard all of that out and about. And so what was going to happen in this last presidential election? Well, in 2020, Joe Biden, when you look at the counties, out of 254 Texas counties, Joe Biden only won 22 of them. Only 22 out of 254 counties. And I think what's interesting is when you look at the map, this was the election results by county in Texas that you see right now. You can see most of Texas in landmass area, obviously, voted Republican. If you look at the map closely, you can see the I-35 corridor, Dallas-Fort Worth, and just north of the Metroplex. You can see Austin, San Antonio, that area, Houston, Harris County, and then some of the valley. You can see that's still voted Democratic. Now, I think what's interesting is you look at the shades. Obviously, the darker the blue, the more heavily Democratic. The darker the red, the more heavily Republican. And when you look at the map, you can see shades of red. For example, north of the Metroplex, it's a light shade. People are moving out of the city. You can see in Houston down toward the coast, it's a lighter shade of red. But then on the other side, you can see the valley, which has always been a heavily Democratic area. There's a lot of Republican counties that went Republican, are a lighter shade of blue. So you can see, and when you look at all the dynamics of what's going on right now in the political scene over the last year and a half, stuff currently with what's going on down at the border, for example, specifically to Texas, I think that had an impact. So even though people said we were going blue, and a lot of people were really pushing in the 2020 election that it would be a blue result, it didn't happen. And then you look at another important fact, and that is no Democrat has held a statewide office in Texas since 1994. And that is a huge, huge thing. So are we going blue? Are we staying red? Well, with all, again, like I said a minute ago, with all the stuff that's going on, all the stuff that's happening in the national political scene and locally here in Texas, most pundits, most experts, most people will say that this session, the 87th legislative session, was the most conservative in the history of our state. And when you see the legislation, you can see why that's the case. So before we actually get into some of the nuts and bolts, most of you that know me have been around my presentations. I'd like to interject a little bit of cartoon activity, add a little levity to my presentation. So hopefully you're sitting there listening right now, you see this slide and you're chuckling. If not, then that's your loss. But anyway, so let's dive into the actual, more of the actual presentation and some statistics for the 87th session. As you can see on the slide that's in front of you now, there were a total of 6,927 bills filed during the 87th legislative session. That's not including special sessions. That's just a regular session. Of those 6,927 bills, 4,671 were House bills and a little over 2,200 were Senate bills. You can see that on your slide. Of course, all those bills that were presented, all those bills that went to committee and all those other things, they could have died in committee. We all know there's a lot of ways that a bill can die during a session, but only 15.5% of the bills actually passed. That's 1,073. You can see there on the slide the number of bills vetoed, the education-related bills, 1,100 plus that were actually tracked during the session, and then of course the bill book that we covered through our service center contacts and political consultants. And it was quite a bit of research, and we appreciate that. Some of the dynamics of this session, and you can see in this slide, it started slow. I remembered I had dinner with a representative the first week of the session, and this notoriously slow the first week. And of course, you got to remember we're coming out of COVID, and he made the comment to me as we're sitting there eating at the County Line Barbecue in Austin, which we know is a lot of our favorite place. He said, there's not an appetite to get a lot done this session. And it always starts slow anyway, the session, and that happened this year, but then once everything really broke loose after all the different things that happened, it actually, they made up for lost time, let's just put it that way. A lot of things did happen the second half of the session. People in the Senate blame the House for some problems. People in the House blame the Senate for, and we'll talk a little bit more of that here in a minute. But so there was a lot of, I guess, the Texas up until a few sessions ago had always kind of taken pride in the fact that we did things a little differently in Texas. We didn't get really involved in national politics or how they conducted business in Washington, D.C. I think we've all seen that the last few years. That's changed. And this session was no different, as we all know, of what happened at the end of the regular session. So with that said, let's talk a little bit. Well, let me back up first. When you talk about legislation, and I've said this in my legislative updates the last 2 times I've done this, 2 years ago and 4 years ago, most legislation is going to be reactionary. You see that on the bottom of the slide, versus proactive. In other words, something has happened either in the state as a whole, something has happened to a constituent of a representative, and that's when there's legislation passed. Very rarely is it proactive. It's normally reactive. And so again, when you think about this session, when you think about the things that took place and are currently taking place in the national political scene, in Texas specifically, that explains why some of the things were done during this session. Let's look at the educational leadership, or the Austin leadership, I should say. In Austin, first of all, you have Greg Abbott. Greg Abbott is what a lot of people consider a moderate Republican, or has been in the past, and but it's been an interesting session this year with Greg Abbott because he actually currently has 2 people that are going to oppose him in the primary. Both of those candidates, Huff Fines and West, are considered to the right of Abbott. It's going to be interesting to see which one of those 2 garners some support. I think one will garner more support possibly than the other. But still, with that thought, one of those will be, I think, a legitimate contender in the primary. That's made Greg Abbott, I think, steer some of his policies this session even further right than he would have been otherwise. And because he does not want to be labeled a moderate right now in the Republican Party. And we all understand the reasons why. So you have that situation with Greg Abbott. You have the Lieutenant Governor in Dan Patrick. Well, again, a far right, he's aligned far right politically. And we've seen him on, several news shows, national news shows. And I think personally that he is, even though he's flirted with running against Greg Abbott in the past, I think he realizes he probably has more influence on what's taking place legislatively as the Lieutenant Governor than he would as the Governor. So he's going to stay, I believe, and continue to be a Lieutenant Governor. Now, I also believe both of those folks are trying to line themselves up for something in the national political scene. Some people are saying Greg Abbott's going to run for president this next election. We'll see. I think Dan Patrick, if a Republican is elected in the next presidential election, he would love to be, I think, in that administration. So I think both of them have some underlying tone to why they do what they do or what they did this session. Then you see Dade Phelan, the new Speaker of the House. Interesting in that Dade Phelan, Representative Phelan, is considered, Speaker Phelan, I should say, is considered a moderate Republican. And you got to remember that when the Speaker is elected, they have to have enough votes that they would have to have some Democratic support as well as Republican support. There was some talk before the session to change that rule and just do the majority party elect the Speaker and not allow the minority party. That didn't happen. And so because of that, you get a more moderate Speaker than you would, say, for example, Dan Patrick, who is automatically the leader of the Senate due to his lieutenant governorship. So Dade Phelan is moderate, Republican-wise, and he was new. In fact, he had appointed 35 of the 35 House committees. There are 34 new committee chairs. And one of those is Harold Dutton, a Democrat, interestingly enough, from Houston. And he had some background that he was not happy with in the educational system in Houston. And that impacted some of his decisions and his leadership and what he wanted done in the House Ed Committee. But because of all the new committee chairs, a new speaker, they were trying to get their feet wet, trying to get things going. So that obviously the session started slow. But as I said prior to this, it was, needless to say, it changed the last half of the session. You can see now some bills and initiatives that did not pass. There were some things in this, although there was some virtual instruction legislation that did pass later on, but some things did, and then but you can see that the election integrity, even though it's marked out, that was because of the regular session, but we know it did later in a special session. The bill book that I base my information on, that's put together for the Service Center consultants that do the presentations, that's what this book is about. You can see some of the background there. Some major bills. You see that Senate Bill 1, which is Appropriations Bill. What do we do to our budget, basically? It's important to remember. In Texas, it's a law that you cannot pass a deficit budget. It has to be a balanced budget. It's also important to remember that they do it on what they think the revenue is going to be for the next 2 years. So the comptroller, they work with the comptroller to determine what they think the income is going to be, the revenue for the state over the next 2 years. That's what they set their budget at. And it's important to remember that, because if something happens major, who knows what's going to happen. I think it's important property values. For example, 2 sessions ago, there was a balanced budget that was passed based on a 17% increase in property values. We know what's happened to property values. So anyway, it's interesting to understand that process. So that's the budget. The House Bill 2 is a cleanup, and it's interesting because in the special session there was actually a couple of pieces of legislation that wanted to deal with this, because what they do is the legislature will take the leftover money if there's surplus revenue, and then they'll take that money and divide it up or put it into the budget. A lot of times some of it goes to the basic allotment for schools, and that helps as far as more money for districts. Anyway, so that's House Bill 2. You have another House Bill 1525, which helped clean up some things with House Bill 3. I'll talk about that briefly in a minute. Educators' favorite bill of the session, and I say that if you can sense my sarcastic tone, House Bill 4545, there has been some consternation in school districts in regard to House Bill 4545, and then Senate Bill 1365 that deals with accountability. So we'll look at some of those plus some other things as we go through this. Senate Bill 1, the Appropriations Bill, I won't bore you with a lot of stuff about that, but again, I think it's important to remember when you look at the increase in funding from one year to the next, you can see the first column, or the middle column, is for the 22-23 school year. We're currently in the 2021 school year. You'll see some increases, or in the sessions, I should say. The legislators love to say that they have increased the budget or put more money in education. It's important to remember that, especially with all the ESSER funds we have coming from the federal government right now, they're using a lot of those funds to supplant the current budget. And so even though they're saying they're putting more money in it, they're taking a lot of federal money and putting it and basically saving local revenues and using the federal money to replace it. And so just understand that little piece as you, when you hear that they've put more money in education. They have, but they've taken out of this pot because they're getting some money over here from the federal government. The Supplemental Appropriations, again, you can see what I said a minute ago as far as taking money that was left over from the previous session or the previous 2-year budget cycle, taking that money and using that to supplement other things in the budget for this next school year. In House Bill 1525, you can see a few things in here. Again, as this deals with House Bill 3 in a lot of ways. One of the good things about last session, for the first time, we weren't reactive, we were proactive in education. We have had a history and educators have had a history of going to when they go to the Capitol of complaining, or they go to the representative centers and just complaining about what's being done. And I know as a superintendent, I would be told, give us solutions, give us solutions. And House Bill 3 in the last session is the most proactive piece of legislation, quite frankly, in a long time when it comes to public ed. And it was a good piece of legislation. Was it perfect? And we admit, everybody admits that, but it was a great piece of legislation. Now, 1525 helped clean up some of those issues when it came to House Bill 3. Again, you can see some more things that are part of that. You see the extends the grants to provide support services with students with autism and dyslexia. There's a very concerted effort early in the session to, by parents, by support groups, by advocates to help get money into services for folks with autism and dyslexia. We're seeing more of that in education, in our students. And so what do we need to do, or what can we do as educators to help in those areas? You can see some COVID-19 funds when it comes to ESSER. And you see there a tax swap is no longer allowed. Some school districts used to do that to gain some revenue. It was a risky move. Some people didn't think it was risky. I know personally, early in my tenure as superintendent, where I was, we did a TRE. We looked at the tax swap. It just didn't. I did not like that. We just went straight out for the TRE to try to generate revenue that way. Comp Ed, increased the Comp Ed allotment. And again, I think that's huge when it comes to helping, especially students that are classified as homeless. You're seeing more of that, more and more of that classification now. What is that definition of homeless? It can be pretty broad. Other than what you would consider truly homeless, to possibly a student that's not living with any immediate family member, that might be living in the home of a teacher, or another person that might not be part of the immediate family. They're considered homeless as well. So, you look at the definition of what homeless is, but those numbers are increasing in Texas, and the money to help service those folks has gone up as well. Changing in weights for qualifying career and tech education courses. This is huge. For CTE courses in your schools, they even fund down now in below high school, and because of that, you're getting some extra money in schools. That's going to really help schools pay for teachers, ag teachers, whatever, CTE teachers, whatever those teachers might be. We restored the Gifted and Talented program, as you see in the last bullet there. It restored it and brought it back up to a multiplier of 0.07. You see a few other things there. I'm not going to talk a lot about some of that stuff, but you can see part of 1525, and then a little bit more about 1525. And then the last page of 1525, I think these are again, important things. It adds non-certified teachers to the list of eligible recipients of the teacher incentive allotment. We all know that, especially with the teacher shortage today, we have folks that are doing a great job, but they might not be certified yet. They may be going through a program, but it allows them to be part of the teacher incentive allotment. Again, you can see some things there. You see the third bullet, the SHAC, or the Student Health Advisory Committee. It is the only non-elected group in the state that's subject to the Open Meetings Act, or the Open Meetings Law. And again, I've said this before, sometimes we in education, public education, are our own worst enemies. And we want to be open and transparent, but unfortunately, sometimes some things happen. It doesn't take but one or two situations. And we all know some of this stuff happened, especially with the virtual stuff this past year. And because of that, now we've got some things in regard to sex education and those kind of things that are going to be a lot more open, and so that's happened this session. Extends the deadline for educators to complete the literacy academies. Obviously, those that are in education understand that. Because of COVID and everything that took place the past year and a half, they've extended the deadline for people to do that. You can see a few other things in there as well when it comes to 1525. All right, my second humorous slide. Hopefully you enjoy that. Being it's Halloween, close to Halloween, and I have a few head of cattle, and so I think feeding cubes to kids is a very realistic Halloween treat. So hopefully you got a chuckle out of that. Let's talk 4545 right quick. House Bill 4545 is probably the bill that's caused the most, as I said earlier, the most angst, consternation for educators that came out of this session. What it does, it requires school districts to provide one teacher for every 3 students tutoring until they get caught up. And it's a purpose of accelerated learning. While in theory it's good, and that's for students it used to be the old SSI grade levels, 3rd, 5th, and 8th grade. But the logistics of getting that done has been a nightmare from superintendents that I've talked to. Trying to find the time to get it done when students can fit it in their schedule. I've heard of people doing it, taking kids out of PE, which we don't like, or taking them out of maybe an elective course, or keeping them after school, paying teachers for their off period to do it during their off period, paying them after school, getting other people in the community to come help tutor during the day or after school. So it's one of those things that in theory it's good. We want our kids caught up. We know there's been a loss of learning over the past year and a half, but this is one of those unfunded mandates, and it's costing school districts money in order to get these students caught up. I believe this with all my heart. Educators will do what they need to do to get kids to learn. But this has been a piece of legislation that has really been hard to implement. Plus, school districts haven't gotten all the rules involved or needed in order to carry this out. There's still some interpretation of this bill still to come. And understanding the difference between interpretation and intent of what the legislators that wrote it wanted out of the bill. We'll go to the next slide, and you can see a few more things here on Senate Bill 1365 when it comes to accountability. Some of this had to do with what happened in Houston. Harold Dutton's, the chairman, again, the House Public Ed Committee, Houston ISD was supposed to be taken over by TEA, and Houston ISD filed a lawsuit to keep it from happening. Basically, we're successful with it, and because of that, some things didn't happen that Harold Dutton felt like needed to happen to correct the education problems in Houston ISD. So there are some things that happen with accountability, and you can see the bullets there as I speak. Again, some things still to be deciphered from this in regard to intent versus interpretation. All right, now we're going to get into a few more bills and a few things, and I tried to underline on the bills ones that I thought were maybe a little more applicable. Again, there's no way we could go over all of these, but hopefully this will help in regard to some things that were interesting. Let's talk accountability and assessment first. First bullet you see adds accountability indicator related to completing a CTE program of study. We all know accountability system. We all have our own opinions of that, but I believe this is good. I think we have more and more kids that are going the CTE route when it comes to high school, not necessarily going to a four-year college, maybe going through a two-year post-high school educational program, whether it be some type of trade in the medical field, whatever it might be. And so this will help in accountability standards. I understand that not every kid's going to go to a four-year college. You can see there, the second bullet allows individual graduation committees to disregard performance of EOCs in 12th grade for the last school year, obviously. And this year, there's some catch up to be done. So they're not going to keep kids from graduating necessarily on EOCs in a course test for the year. As Texas National Guard adds that to the list of the military branches that can be counted toward CCMR when you do your accountability and get a little extra funding for that. You see that moves the deadline to require electronic assessments. Obviously, they're still having some issues with using technology to take the standardized test, the STAR test, and so anyway, they're going to push that off for another year. Try to hopefully work out some of the kinks. Interesting one. And I've had some interesting discussion. I've done, I think it's 8 of these prior to my doing this video session today. And I've had a mixed bag of reactions to this next bullet. And that is parents are not going to be required to fill out a FAFSA or a TASFA application. In the past, parents had to fill out a FAFSA. It was required. Now it's not. Parents can opt out. A lot of parents don't want to, people to see what, their financial information is. unfortunately, some of it's a pride thing as well. On the other, you got the well off financially, those that aren't quite as well off. Some people don't like that information to be out, but it's been an interesting reaction to that legislation as I've done these. You can see allows parents or guardians to elect for a student to repeat, retake course or grade. You can see that in the next one. Superintendents have said that there's been a limited amount of this going on, but mainly it's going to be obviously at your elementary level. There's been a few parents that felt like maybe their kids, due to the learning loss, maybe needed to be held back and maybe get that year over again to help them down the road. So that's a little bit about accountability and assessment. Finance. Now let's talk about finance. Senate Bill 289, the first bullet, allows for students with severe or life-threatening illnesses and students attempting to obtain a driver's license to have additional excused absences. How many times have you heard of people going to the driver's license office, they get out of school that morning and they go and sit in a line waiting to get their driver's license with their students, their children. They get to lunch, they're told come back after lunch. They come back, something's happened, and they've got to go back home without getting their license, and they've missed school all day. So there's legislation to help with that. Now those students are allowed some extra days as far as having those excuses or those absences excused. Not only that, for students with severe life-threatening illnesses as well. Students that have to go to the doctor a lot. Those are all excused absences now. This is what that helps with. The interesting one you see allows transportation, instructional materials, and meals for students during a declared disaster to qualify for transportation funding reimbursement. We all know what took place. We had the hurricane. We had Snowmageddon or Freeze-mageddon, whatever you want to call it. And there were students, COVID, obviously. What could we do to get instructional materials to students, get them meals? And in the past, we did not get transportation funding for that. Now we do. We can get that through Senate Bill 462. I think that's good, common sense legislation. And there's a few other pieces of legislation I think are just common sense. Another, on the next slide, you can see prohibition for any contracts with companies that boycott energy companies or discriminate against the firearm ammunition industries. Remember what I said earlier. What was going on in national politics had a huge impact on this session. This is a piece of legislation that obviously is in reaction to some of the things going on in our national and local political scene. And I just wanted to point that out because that's a perfect example. So again, you can see some other things in regard to finance and purchasing. Time for another little cartoon. Again, those of you that know me have been in my trainings. I like to do those. I think this was a good one. And so I don't know, you might be buffering right now. So we'll see. Only you will know that because you're the one watching it. Governance and administration. Let's talk about governance and administration. Okay, the first bullet right there, you can see, allows non-enrolled homeschool students to participate in UL activities. A lot of people call this the Tim Tebow rule. It's one of those things that homeschool folks have been trying to get for a long time. Some homeschool folks, not all, but some homeschool folks have been trying to get the legislature to allow their children, if they're homeschooled, to participate in UIL activities and especially with their local school district. Local, honestly, public schools in Texas have fought this due to some issues. We won't get in all those issues now. I'm sure a lot of you have heard some of those issues. But they finally did get this passed. However, it's important to understand that The only way this will happen, or the only way a student can participate, is if the school district allows it, and it has to be a vote by the board. Now, if the board doesn't put it on the agenda, then nothing changes. But if they do put it on the agenda and vote for it, then UIL homeschool kids are allowed to participate in that schools with their UIL teams. It's also important to remember that they still have to abide by UIL rules. They have to live in the attendance zone, and they have to pass their coursework. They still have no pass, no play. That's part of the issue. How well will that be monitored? That's part of the argument against it. But it has been done. It'll be interesting to see in the next session. Now they kind of got that nose under the proverbial blanket, what's going to happen with that type of legislation moving forward. As a school board member, I'm sure you'll be fired up because now you get to do more training. They have asked that you complete some safety training, school safety training. This has not been developed yet. It's going to be developed by the Texas School Safety Center down in San Marcos. It's my understanding from talking with people it's probably going to be virtual, maybe even online in that regard. But you are going to be required to do some more safety training as a board member. You can see again, I was actually watching the session, let me back up just a minute, and I say this, I was watching the session. To go back to Dan Patrick and Dave Phelan and how they ran their chambers. The Senate pretty much stayed the old-fashioned way. You had to be there. It was hard, obviously, to be in the Capitol when you got there. You had to go through some screening to even be allowed to go in, and you had to wear your mask while you're in there. It was not near the number of people at the Capitol this year when I was down there. But the Senate still kind of did it the old-fashioned way. Show up in person, fill out your cards, for or against, testify in person. The House, on the other hand, you could do all that virtually. There's quite a bit of testimony virtually during the House Public Ed and the other committee hearings. And I said that, I want to make sure I said that because I was actually listening or watching the committee hearing the day that third bullet was discussed, House Bill 3165, where establishing an affirmative defense for truancy in the case where absences are due of voluntary absence from the home resulting from abuse. Sometimes students are in an abusive situation at home and they run away, or they leave and go to another family member's house for a day or two until things cool off. A lot of things can happen. And the committee testimony was those kids don't need to be, for lack of a better word, discriminated against because of their personal situation. So because of that, you have now this particular bill to help students that might be in that kind of situation, unfortunately. The fourth bullet, you can see there, requires districts and charters to adopt policy on the effective use of digital devices. And let me add this. When you see the D and the C at the end of that bill, at the end of that description, D means it's for district schools, C means it's for charter schools. And I think when you see that's interesting, you go back up to the second bullet. I'm sorry I failed to mention this. When it talks about school safety, obviously for charters, excuse me, even though they don't have a school board, they have a board of directors. But that bill does not apply to charter schools, only school districts, independent school districts. All right, and then you go down to the next bullet, allows districts to conditionally operate transportation systems and bus students from outside the district without an interlocal agreement. That was, again, an interesting hearing that day in Public Ed Committee, because what some of your smaller school districts do is and a lot of districts allow transfer students. You have a few smaller districts around the state that's their lifeblood. We have one school district in Region 10 that's over 70% of their students are transfer students. The particular district I was listening to this day, it's a school district that has over 90% of their students as transfer students. And they could not, before this legislation, go in those districts and pick up students from a neighboring district without an interlocal agreement from that district. Now, obviously, you can just imagine how many of those interlocal agreements took place, because most school districts, they need students, and they're not going to allow another district to come into their district, pick up a student on their buses, and then take them out of their district and go to school at the smaller district or the one allowing transfers. So this legislation now allows a school district to go into another district, pick up students without their permission. So if we'll say if you've got if without putting anybody on queue here, if you got District A here, District B here, District A wants to go into District B and pick up kids and bring them back to District A, take them back to District B, and then come back, that's now allowed. And you do not have to have agreement with both districts in order to get that done. So you can see where that could be, that opens up some potential for not great relationships with neighboring districts. I can say the one in Hunt County that is in this situation told us at a previous legislative update training that they were not going to go into a neighboring district and pick up students that wanted to transfer to theirs. The parents would still have to find, or the guardians would still have to find transportation for those kids. Okay, another common sense and a huge, I think, common sense legislation, and it's huge, is the next to last bullet there on that page of governance and administration. And that's alter some requirements around donation of unserved and unused food by a school. If you ever walked through a school cafeteria in the last few years, students were required to get food on their tray even though they didn't want it. And you would go through there, and the amount of food that was being thrown away and being just wasted away was alarming, and it was sad, and it couldn't be used for anything else. Now, with this legislation, if you have food that's left over, it can go to a food bank. And I think that's a good thing, and that was a good piece of common sense legislation. The second page, as far as governance and administration, you can see that limits a district's ability to limit, regulate, or interfere with a child's participation in a learning pod. Learning pods started during COVID. You would have a group of students that would get together, and parents might hire a tutor or a teacher or somebody to teach the kids. I guess that somebody out there felt like that was interfering in the school district's job. I don't know exactly all the background behind that, but anyway, that was an interesting piece of legislation. And again, if you look at that, it's only school districts, not charters. Interesting. You can see there on the next bullet, bullying is now part of PEMS. So you have to record if a kid's been bullied or did the bullying. That's all part of PEMS records now. And then the state now does not want to call students limited English proficient anymore, what we used to call LEP students. They now are officially going to be referred to as emerging bilingual students. Emerging bilingual students. So that is now the new term for limited English proficiency students. Again, you can see a few things left on that page. You can look at that and see. And then in regard to elections, again, I'll say it again, I'll sound like a broken record. Things that have happened over the past year and a half, including elections. And you can see 3 pieces of legislation that deal strictly with election and how they are administered. And we all know right now, at the time of the taping of this, we are getting ready to be, we're in early voting right now for the November 2nd election. And so that happens next week. And it's been interesting to go in and vote. Where I went in and we had 2 different poll watchers in there. And of course, I live in a small community of commerce. And we don't have a lot of controversy there when it comes to that kind of stuff. But it's just been interesting to see the changes when it comes to the administration of elections. And you can see that in that particular slide. A few other things, again, not going to talk about that, but still those are things that deal with advisory councils, eminent domain, those kind of things. The last page in regard to governance administration, a person that is 17 and they meet certain qualifications, can now join the Texas State Guard. And that bill was passed. Allows students, the second bullet, who are receiving outpatient mental health services from a mental health facility to participate in UI activities. Again, this is one of those sessions I was listening to that particular day, and apparently there was a student that was missing school to go to have some services away from school. They were having some mental health issues. Because of that, they were missing an athletic period or practice, and they weren't being allowed to play. Because of that, now you have House Bill 1080, which you can't hold that against students anymore. They need to be allowed to participate. And then you can see that the last bullet on this page, if we all remember, you might remember this, the student down in the valley that was upset with the official that had kicked him out of the game, and the official, while basically giving the signal for what was going on, this football player ran from the sideline and just basically clocked the, not with a fist, but hit him pretty hard and knocked him down and knocked him a little cuckoo. So because of that, because of that action, that one student, now we have this legislation. Again, I'll go back, reactionary versus proactive. And when you look at this legislation that we've talked about so far, we're talking about legislation that's been in reaction to things that have taken place over the last few years. All right, next we'll talk about human resources. Some things going on in human resources. Here you see the first bullet that's underlined. Some interesting conversation in this. I have, and some of you have probably served on the grand jury. And technically, a person's not, you can be charged with a crime, but you've just been charged. You're not guilty of anything, or you haven't gone to a grand jury and been indicted. Well, if you're an educator and you have been charged with an improper relationship with a student, then now by law, the school district cannot release that name, because we all know it might not be indicted. There might not be enough evidence, and so there might not be an indictment. And there are some reputations of some educators they feel have probably been destroyed during that interim period, and even though they're not guilty of anything, they were still, their name was still out there in the news. So now it's against the law to publish that. We all know, especially in smaller communities, kids talk. Who knows where? I mean, the word might get out, but you as a school district cannot release that name. So make sure you're not responsible for that, because now it's against the law. You can see the next underlined bullet down there, increases liability protection for districts and charters, hired and volunteer security personnel. So again, just helping with, I think, again, reaction to some of the things in regard to the some folks and their feelings toward law enforcement. And so that's what this is about. Clarifies the definition of sexual harassment and the need to report it and the responsibility to report it immediately. And then the last bullet, you can see there that it requires school counselors to spend at least 80% of their time counseling. What's happened over the years when we began doing all the testing, counselors kind of became pseudo testing coordinators, and they didn't get to spend a lot of time counseling kids. If you think back to the last legislative session, there was a huge amount of mental health legislation, kids dealing with mental health issues, and now after this past year and a half, it's even more so. And so this allows school districts to make sure their counselors are performing counseling duties 80% of the time. I know a lot of school districts have social workers now that help with this as well, and they have licensed counselors. So school districts doing a great job for the most part in trying to help meet the needs of their students emotionally and in other ways. And then our last slide in regard to human resources. This has had an impact on school districts this year, and that is paying for rehires. In the past, if you hired a teacher or somebody to come back that's retired and they were considered rehires, the person you hired was responsible for paying for that TRS contribution. It's right at 15%, and normally school district pays for half. If you're a regular employee, the school district picks up half, you as an employee pick up half. Then prior to this legislation, if you hired a retired employee, the employee picked up all of that 15% because in theory that person was taking the place of a potential employee that would be contributing to TRS. Now, with this legislation, the school district has to pick up that 15%. In fact, I was in the, I tell this story every time I do this, I was in the superintendent's office visiting with the superintendent the day that this legislation came down, and he had his athletic director in his office with him, and he basically told him, he says, no more rehires can teach full time. Can't afford it as a district. And so that kind of took that away. Now, what a lot of school districts are doing, they might be hiring a rehire person. If they're in especially if they're coaching, just pay them a small stipend to do nothing but coach. That's all they do. But if they're teaching full time, you still got to pay that 15% for those rehire folks. And again, that's one of those. I think the intention of this legislation was good, but an unintended consequence was the increased cost of school districts. There is a shortage of school district teachers these days, and because of that, a lot of school districts are trying to find anybody they can find to teach. And because of that, they're looking for rehire experienced teachers. So if you do it, you're going to have to pay. So that's it for the human resource page. My next little cartoon, I've had a pretty good, some folks, I did that the other night and they thought it was quite funny, especially for those of us that are overweight. We would like that particular cartoon. Let's talk instruction. Let's talk a little bit about that. A lot of underlined in this particular section. You can see there, instruction creates an advisory committee to promote. Again, let me back up before I get into this. Look at every one of these and think about what's been going on in our country. And think about what I said earlier about this being the most conservative legislative session that's ever taken place in Texas. You look at every one of these in regard to instruction on this page, and what do you see? Okay? Advisory Committee to promote patriot education and increase awareness of Texas values to continue to stimulate boundless prosperity across the state. That's a statewide committee. Has to do that. You see the second bullet, quite interesting. Expands the opportunity for schools to offer courses on the Old Testament and New Testament of the Bible to 6th grade. Currently, it limits it to just high school or 9th grade. Now, all the way down into middle school and the 6th grade level, you can teach Old Testament and New Testament courses. Third bullet's interesting. Now in driver's ed courses, some schools still teach driver's ed. Some do, some don't. But you got to talk about the dangers of road racing. And I kind of put my foot in my mouth one of the first nights I did this. I kind of made light of that until one of the school districts in attendance said, well, we lost a student to road racing a year ago. I went, oh, sorry. And promptly took my foot out of my mouth. But it's now required to be part of the driver's ed coursework. And for school districts that still do teach driver's ed, that will be added. You see the next bullet. Add specific text and documents required for the SBOE to include in social studies. Again, social political issues that may not be included in required teacher training, classroom instruction. Immediate action concerns how topics are addressed. Okay? In other words, how do we teach current events? And that's going to be looked at. And you can see that's concern. And we understand why in Texas, with what's been going on in the national news and in local news, of why that's a concern to legislators. Again, I will say again, this has been the most conservative legislative session in the state of Texas in their history, and you can see, and this is part of the reason why it's considered that. Adds language to the mission and objectives of public ed to now include inform American patriotism and lead students in a close study of the founding documents for the U.S. and Texas. Again, let's think about all that's been going on in our nation and going on around in regard to some things politically, and you can understand where that's coming from. And then character traits, positive character traits. This is also the most involved the legislature's ever been in, for lack of a better term, writing curriculum. They don't not writing the curriculum, but interjecting in the curriculum in the state of Texas. A little bit more about instruction. Expands access to parent guardians to all instructional materials and instructional materials associated with remote or virtual learning. Some things happened during COVID that is causing this particular legislation. If you follow the news, you know what I'm talking about too as well. Requires TA to develop an agriculture education program for public elementary schools. I have a sister-in-law who teaches art out in Vega, Texas, west of Amarillo. She teaches in the elementary. But this year, she is now teaching ag to elementary school students, along with her art classes. Loves it. She's a certified ag teacher by trade. But it's been interesting. She says it's been interesting, and of course that's an ag community, but I think that allows some smaller communities to maybe do some of that instruction that might be more specific for their community. Adds a required academic advisor for schools and institutes of higher ed that offer dual credit program. Again, just making sure students, and there's a lot more dual credit programs have taken over pre-AP and AP coursework. And so they just want to make sure that they have plenty of knowledge and help for students at the high school and at the college level. And then something to do with pre-K and instruction. It's making sure that there's class size limits for pre-K classrooms. Again, most classrooms or pre-K classrooms are going to have a teacher and an aide, but this just makes sure that this particular legislation makes sure it gets done. And then some stuff dealing with special ed. You've got some special ed complaint timeline extensions, now from 1 year to 2 years. That is that changed now. If a parent wants to file a complaint, they have now up to 2 years to file a complaint on a situation. You can see the other two things dealing with IEPs. One of the arguments, one of the concerns, I should say, during COVID, during the virtual learning, were students that had IEPs they were not getting met. Their needs were not getting met. and that caused some decline in learning with those students. Legitimate concern. There were some issues, and this particular legislation deals with that. You can see the last bullet provides grants up to $1,500 for supplemental and special ed services. In the state of Texas, we have one service center that handles all this. You have to actually apply for this grant. Region 10 is the coordinator of that for the state of Texas. So if you know of anybody that wants to apply for this grant, $1,500 grant, contact folks here at Region 10 and they'll get you in the right place to help you file for that opportunity. A little bit about educator preparation now as we move along. The first bullet, there are going to be some requirements now dealing with a focus specifically on educating students with disabilities, and again, some training and staff development with that. The second bullet's interesting, creates a bilingual special ed certification to teach emergent, there's that term, emergent bilingual students with disabilities. And so again, it's adding some more certification and training for folks who are going to work with those students. And then the third bullet there requires the SBEC board to include membership from small and mid-sized schools. I think that's a good thing. I think sometimes small and mid-sized schools kind of get overlooked because what's good in a big urban district when it comes to teacher certifications makes it's a little tougher in your small rural schools. And so let's have some representation on the SBEC board in regard to setting up certain certifications for educators. I won't talk a lot about property tax. Obviously, it's a hot topic. There'll be some things that happen in the special session that deals with this. I just wanted to make sure that this particular one I have underlined allows a property tax exemption for property leased by school districts and open enrollment charters and property owned by open enrollment charters. The charter schools really went after this during the session. Obviously, we have charter schools here in Region 10. In the past, they've had to pay tax on the property they lease, purchase. Now that this takes that out, they no longer have to do that, just like school districts. A few more things about property taxes. And again, I'll let you can pause and look over these, but again, not anything I felt like was just really, really huge for discussion in this presentation. All right, another little slide here in honor of Halloween. Hopefully you got a chuckle out of that. If somebody's been going through some oral surgery, I kind of appreciate this. Let's talk safety and security now. All of you, if not by now, or if you haven't, you may have already done this. Now, due to House Bill 103, you have to have an active shooter alert system for everybody within a 50-mile radius. You got to let everybody know that there's an active shooter, and so that, again, that's a good thing for letting people know what's going on at your campus. See the bottom bullet requires persons and professionals who have reasonable cause to believe that abuse or neglect is happening to a child to immediately make a report. You just immediately need to let folks know that there's an issue. And so it's important to understand that. No waiting, hesitating, investigating or anything like that. Second page of safety and security. On the back of your student ID cards, you now have suicide prevention information that's required to be on there for grades 6 through 12. If your school district does student IDs, that is required to be on there. Another bullet there establishes a volunteer cybersecurity incident response team. Cybersecurity is getting huge. It's not real hard to get IP addresses, honestly, and try to hack into or mess with school district or businesses or whatever their emails, their websites. So now you have to have an incident response team for that. And the last bullet there, it's good legislation, but I think it's going to be interesting to see how it's carried out. It's asking for A parent requirement for updating contact information 2 weeks after the first of the year or change in information. For those of us that have been in this business very long, you understand at the beginning of the year you can get some information, and a month later you try to locate that student or you try to contact the parents, you can't find them. And it's tough to get that information. But now you're required to try to keep that. You got to track those people down. Obviously, it's good for the school district to have current information. But if the parent doesn't cooperate, it's kind of tough to do. Even cell phone numbers. They may be temporary numbers, temporary phones. So a phone number that works at the beginning of the year might not work 3 months later. So it's try to do your best to keep that information up to date. You see the next underline there on the third page of the safety and security. Increases punishment for trafficking, online solicitation of minor, and prostitution and as requirements for specific related signage at schools. So now you've got to add signage next to your gun signage on your windows at your entry, where people enter into your school, in regards to the punishment that has to deal. And we all know a serious problem right now is child sex trafficking. It's a huge issue, and it's growing. And so this is legislation to help and require schools to make sure people understand the punishments. And then adds monthly testing requirements for AEDs. Obviously, there was a school district somewhere that went to pull out the AEDs on somebody and it didn't work. And even though a lot of them update automatically, or they test automatically, we still got to go around and make sure these AEDs are working. And so now there's legislation that you got to make sure that they're charged and some immunity from liability for their use. So make sure, again, just to do things right, make sure you know how to use them. Well, we kind of got to the end of the the regular session, and we didn't have an official sine die. It didn't happen. As we all know, some folks got on a plane and flew to Washington, D.C. We all remember the picture on the airplane. They were all sitting there kind of happy with their case of beer in the seat as they were flying to Washington, D.C. And while they were there, the whole first special session, nothing happened. I was talking to a representative during that time. He says they show up in the morning, they roll call, they do their stuff, they don't have a quorum, they go, they leave. And they had to be there every day during that time for that. So nothing got done during the first legislative session. And so that came, Governor Abbott said, he's going to call a second one. He called immediately a second special session. Now, let's just say that at the beginning of the session, they still were there, the folks that left still weren't there. I talked to my friend, good friend that's a representative, and when I talked to him during that first week, he said, well, rumor has it that they're back in town, they're back in the state. We're hearing they may show back up any day now. He said, we hope they do, because the inevitable is going to happen. And sure enough, about 2-3 days later, they started coming back in, and they were able to start getting the business. So you can see some of the things. I'll go over some of the things that was passed during the second special session. Controversial legislation, some of it. Election reform, election integrity, whatever you want to call it. But it passed. Again, quite controversial, but it was passed. Some bond reform was passed as well, and you can see that. It comes to, bail bonds and applying bonds for folks who commit crime. Border security, again, if you remember correctly, what I said at the beginning, some things were done in this session because of what's been going on the national political scene and in the local political scene. And we all know what's going on down at the border. So then some legislation during the second session was passed in regard to that. Some social media censorship I sound like a broken record, right? But again, it happened. Some things that took place during the last election. So there's legislation in regard to social media and that. The abortion bill, or the right to life bill, depending on which side you fall on that. The heartbeat bill, again, quite controversial, but it was passed. And as we all know now, the Supreme Court ruled that it can be enacted even during, while they're going through the whole process of deciding whether or not it's legal or not. A little bit more in regard to the second session. You can see that, what was passed there, funding, the actual running of it, virtual learning. You remember earlier, I said it wasn't. Now it is, but there again, there's several things on a checklist you have to go down in order to qualify for the funding out of Senate Bill 15 when it comes to virtual education. And then some stuff concerning nuclear waste. So then the second session ended, but not everything was done that he wanted to have done. And so we went to a third special session, and it ended October 19th. And there were some things in that session that were passed. And if you go through the governor's call, you see, for example, right here, number 1. All right, redistricting. Every 10 years it happens. There's already lawsuits have been filed that deals with redistricting, and there was 10 years ago. And so it's going to be interesting to see. My slides I have a little bit of, and it's going to be hard for you to see probably. You can see the Senate districts there, and the proposed Senate districts. There are a few changes in that. But if you want to, when you do this, if you want to go back and forth, you can see some of the differences. Same thing with the House and the House districts and how they are planned. In fact, you see a big change in East Texas. Some of you folks up in Grayson and Fannin County and Delta County, House District 62 has been added Franklin County to it now. A lot of people say there's the only thing, and they, part of the rule is they have to be connecting. They say the only thing connecting Delta and Franklin County is a 2-lane highway, but it is connecting. That's kind of the joke. But Chris Patty is retiring, so a lot of his area got split up out there in deep East Texas. But I wanted to include those maps for you as well. And you can see, again, a closer look in Northeast Texas of those school districts, of those house districts that I was talking about. You can see that house district there, map, and then there it is compared to another one. And in fact, I circled that one with Franklin County. All right, then you've got the second thing. Appropriations for the American Rescue Plan, or ESSER funds. $19 billion came to the state of Texas this time, and they trying to figure out how to appropriate that money and how to do it. So that passed. You can see part of it right there. It talks about they earmarked $7.2 billion for the state's unemployment compensation fund, and then $2 billion for to surge staffing at hospitals. Now, obviously, with COVID, there was a big increase in unemployment. People needing unemployment, although it's interesting, I heard the other day, employment in Texas is one of the lowest in the nation right now at 5.2%. But still, there were record claims. So this will help replenish the coffers for their unemployment. And then you can see the staffing hospitals. Obviously, that's been tough with some of the things going on right now with vaccination mandates and other things. So that's to help hospitals hopefully keep their hospitals staffed. But I think the third thing there, the legislation also included over $500 million for broadband infrastructure. That was a huge theme to this session, especially in rural areas, being able to have broadband. And so there's a lot of money and a lot of emphasis going on for that over the next few years. Number 3 there, Senate Bill 29. This is interesting. Students can only compete in UL activities based on their the original birth certificate. UL had a rule, as most people know, that had this already. But actually what was happening, there were actually parents taking students to a judge down, I believe in Houston, that was changing the birth certificates of students and their gender. And so because of that, in order, for several myriad of reasons. So in reaction to that, our legislature passed Senate Bill 29, which again takes that out of play at this time. You see number 4, this was another mandate that the governor wanted to, that Texas can mandate an individual received, or that no government agency can mandate a vaccine. It did not happen. It did not pass. That was one thing. I think because of the House and the more moderate leadership, it didn't happen. And then number 5, you can see that there's actually an issue with this particular Senate Bill 474 that dealt with how you can find dogs, and the governor vetoed it. Felt like it was a little bit of overreach, so they came back and reintroduced a little bit different legislation. And it passed. In fact, I added a little slide in here for that. Eddie Lucio from Brownsville, Democrat, basically took the language that would have allowed dog owners to use chains to restrict their dogs out of the legislation. So anyway, it ended up passing, and you can see another little thing about a mandated 24-hour waiting period and how you handle pets during severe weather. So just what I'd add that little bit extra in there. And this was interesting. This passed at the last moment that in November, or maybe the next election, there's going to be a constitutional amendment that will allow the increase of the state homestead exemption from $25,000 to $40,000. And that would, and again, that's something that, is a good thing in regard to taxes and the taxpayer. So now, this was introduced by Senator Bittencourt. Now they can go back and say, hey, we passed property tax reduction. People consider that kind of an election bill. And the next slide, Senate Bill 52, being a Texas A&M University of Commerce or an old East Texas State grad, I had to throw this in there that this didn't get passed, excuse me, this didn't get passed during the regular session, but it slid in here at the end of this third special session, and there was actually almost $45 million for a new ag facility, educational facility at A&M Commerce. Now, I'm a good friend, and a lot of you know Mark Cahey had to brag about $90 million for Tarleton, but we're not going to worry about Tarleton. We're just worried about A&M Commerce. And so, anyway, we're excited about that at TAMUC, or as the old hats used to call it, ET, and a lot of folks still do. Just something to be aware of, though. A couple of things were introduced but did not pass. House Bill 80 was a voucher that was introduced and by Representative Middleton out of District 23, and but it didn't pass. It's very similar to previous bills, and this is going to continue to be a situation to watch in the coming sessions. But there's still going to be a move for vouchers. Again, that's in reaction to a lot of the consternation you're seeing in school districts today. A couple of other things, tax compressions, and you can look at those over. They didn't get passed, but they were introduced. There's going to continue to be a desire to compress taxes in school district taxation. But again, do you have the money to take its place? And then what's the long-term effect? But it didn't happen, so thank goodness it's there. Now, the question is, will there be a fourth session? Quite frankly, as we conclude, there will not be an intent, or there's not an intention to be or have a fourth session. Folks, they're tired, honestly. They are ready to end this particular session, be done, get back in their districts. Representatives have to get ready for another election here coming soon, but they're ready to move on, and obviously some senators have to get ready for an election as well. But technically, it's over, it's done, and that's all. And so that's it for this particular presentation. We'll see what happens as things unfold from this legislative session. You'll be having several updates, policy updates that come out of this session over the next few months as everything gets written up by TEA and Taxation and School Board, and everybody works together in that regard. Normally I end this session with questions, comments, and criticisms. Obviously you don't have that ability since this is being done virtually, but if for some reason you do have a question or if you want some more information, you can contact me through the Service Center, or you can find these resources that we use to do this presentation. I hope you enjoyed this. Hope you got a couple of chuckles too. Hope you found it interesting. I appreciate your patience and your time, and have a great rest of your day.